Likutei Sichos, Chelek Chavdalet, volume 24, the second Sicha of Parshas Vayelech. This Sicha will explain a mitzvah which is mentioned in this Parsha, namely the mitzvah, the obligation of each Jew writing or being part of the writing of a Sefer Torah. Also, it will explain how this was accomplished in the desert right before they entered Eretz Yisrael, and an amazing lesson for our times. Just as a note, in the spring of 1981, the Rebbe came out with a campaign to write a Torah to unite all Jewish children, boys and girls, under the age of Bar Mitzvah. Later, there was another campaign to write a Sefer Torah Hakloli, which is for all Jews, meaning adults, anyone over the age of Bar Mitzvah, to unite them too. So, in the years 1981, later 1982, the Rebbe spoke very much regarding this issue, this matter, namely of writing the Sefer Torah, the halachas that go into it, the idea behind it, and so on. For example, this Sikha that we're going to learn now is a compilation of the Sikha that was delivered on Yutes Kislev, and then later the following Farbrengens in Tofshin Mem Beis, which is the end of 1981, beginning later of 1982. So, just as an introduction, so we're better familiar with the Sikha, it's worthwhile to review the psukim, the verses, in chapter 31, Dvarim, Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 19 through 21, where over there it gives the commandment of writing this Sefer Torah, and it says, "Because with this you shall come to the land, and this will be a testimony that you will, and a reminder that you will adhere to all that's written over here." Now, the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah, as I mentioned, is literally writing a whole Torah, or at least having a participation in the Torah, or at the very least, which is also considered like one has fulfilled a mitzvah, when a Sefer Torah, let's say for example, is purchased, and one gets it checked and corrected, even by just merely correcting one letter in the Sefer Torah, it's considered to be like you wrote it. Because remember, if that letter were not to be corrected, the entire Torah will be unfit for use as a Torah. Another thing to be familiar with, on the day that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, that is the 7th of Adar, this is right prior to them entering Eretz Yisrael, it says that he wrote a Torah for each Shevet, for each tribe. And the Chachamim, the sages in the Talmud, make a big deal out of this. Wow! He wrote 13 Torah scrolls in one day. 12 he distributed amongst the 12 tribes, and one was put for safekeeping in the Aron, in the Ark. Another thing to be familiar with, there's a very interesting discussion and a debate as to how exactly the original Torah was written. Of course, now we have a finished product. We know that we have the Chamisha Chumshe Torah, the 5 books of the Torah. But how did that come about? Well, some suggest that every time throughout the 40 years that Hashem spoke to them and gave them a mitzvah, gave them the verses, they wrote it down on separate scrolls. Later, it was all combined together. Moshe completed it, and that's how he was able to complete 13 in one day, as we'll see later. Another opinion holds, no, that is not possible. Rather, they wrote it in order, meaning there were times when Hashem spoke or episodes took place, but in the Torah they appear much later. So they wrote one scroll, an entire scroll, as they advanced in the scroll in the order which we have today. However, then there is opinion of Rashi that no, the Torah was not written as they went along for the 40 years, but rather it was written at the end of the 40 years when they had a complete Torah. Another thing to be familiar with, an esrog. An esrog in Lulav, the Torah says, "Ulekachtem lochem bayom rishon." You should take to you. That means that when one does the mitzvah with an esrog in Lulav, it's not like, let's say, tefillin, that it does not have to belong to you, as long as you even don't need permission, perhaps sometimes, to borrow it. But rather, the esrog and the lulav needs to be yours. You have to have ownership. In fact, sole ownership. It has to totally belong to you. For example, if it's an esrog that was bought in partnership, that's not okay, because you don't fully own that esrog and lulav. what is done when one wants to use someone else's esrog and lulav is you give it to them matana al minas lahachzir. You give them a gift stipulating that it's on condition that they have to return it. So it's a gift for as long as they are holding on to it, but it's not going to be theirs forever. One more thing to be familiar with, the concept that the Gemara calls leiv bezdin masna aleim. Literally translated is that the heart of bezdin makes a stipulation, makes conditions, stipulates conditions. What does this mean? That there are certain matters that it's as if bezdin pays attention to the potential issues that may come up, and they stipulate all conditions, and this is valid even if the bezdin doesn't actively do it. That means it's kind of set already in motion. From the virtue of the fact that there is a bezdin in existence, meaning the sages of the Talmud or the Sanhedrin, that it's as if they verbally stipulated conditions. Let's get into the actual Sicha. One of the mitzvahs that Bnei Yisrael were commanded at the end of the 40 years, in fact, very close to the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the same day, is the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. And in the words of the Rambam, it's a positive commandment, quote unquote, on each and every single Jew to write a Sefer Torah for oneself. Now, since the commandment, as you saw in the verse, says, Ve'ata kisvu lachem, and now you should write it for you, and this also comes as an introduction, and almost as you see from the verses as a prerequisite of theirs to go into Eretz Yisrael. So it's understood that each and every single Jew immediately observed it. They were commanded to do it right away. They did it right away. But the question is, wait, this was commanded to them, as we said, on the day that Moshe passed away. We don't find anywhere that there should be any mention of the fact that every single Jew wrote a Sefer Torah, or at least that they started a Sefer Torah. Moreover, in order to write so many Sefer Torah, there were 600,000 men, just the men alone, over the age of 20. So in order to write so many Sefer Torah, you know what kind of quantity of parchment and ink and quills is necessary, let alone the fact that not everybody is skilled and trained in writing a Sefer Torah. Even today we find that just a very small minority is expertly trained in writing a Sefer Torah. Now when it comes to the 13th Sefer Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, we find a major mention in Chazal about it, because indeed it was a great feat. Think about it, to write so many Sefer Torah. So if indeed everybody actually wrote a Sefer Torah from the 600,000 men, or at least started one, can you imagine that? So it certainly would have been mentioned, but it's not mentioned anywhere. So what exactly happened? In the one hand, we understand that they did fulfill the mitzvahs they were commanded to do. Otherwise, they would not be able to enter Eretz Yisrael. And it says Va'ata now, but on the other hand, there's no mention of this anywhere, besides the impossibility of it. Now, there are those commentaries that explain, when it comes to, for example, the 13th Sefer Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, that indeed he didn't write 13 of them in one day. Rather, he wrote them over the course of the 40 years, and he only completed them in the last day of his life. And that is possible, to complete 13 Sefer Torah, to write very quickly, and to complete the last few parshas or the last few psukim, that might be possible. And in other words, every single time Hashem gave him a commandment or told him a parsha, he wrote it down. And therefore, perhaps one would suggest, maybe this is what is meant with that every single Jew fulfilled the mitzvah writing a Sefer Torah on this last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. Right? That when they heard, because every time they heard a new parsha, they recorded it, they wrote it down, or they had a scribe write it for them. On this last day, one would suggest that they did the same, like Moshe Rabbeinu did. They completed it, and that's why it's counted like they wrote it. Says the Rebbe, this is not a good answer. This does not really work out. Why? Because this answer can only make sense according to the opinion, as we mentioned in the introduction, which holds that they wrote it in separate scrolls and then later combined them in the right order as we have it today, or even according to the opinion that holds that it was written on the proper order as we have it today, meaning that if there was something that occurred earlier but was supposed to be written in later, they stalled and they waited and they filled it in later. And then that this would make sense according to these opinions. But it won't sit right with the opinion of Rashi that the entire Torah was written at the end of the 40 years. How will we reconcile this question? How were they able to write so many Sefer Torah in one day? Not only the 600,000 men, but even that which we know about, Moshe Rabbeinu. How did he write 13 Sefer Torah in one day? And of course, the main question is, we don't find any big deal mentioned about this in the words of Chazal. So to summarize the question, it's certain that they fulfilled the mitzvah as they were commanded to, but the question that obviously is to be asked is what exactly did they do in order to implement this mitzvah? So the Rebbe says we'll understand the answer to this by first introducing a very famous question that's asked. And the question is, since the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah is a positive commandment on each and every single Jew, the question is, how is it that we don't find that Jews in general, and especially the Gdolei Yisrael, all the great giants of Jewish history, the great tzaddikim, the great pious people, we don't find it that they should observe this mitzvah in the literal sense, namely writing a Sefer Torah, and especially not even on their day of their Bar Mitzvah. Remember, on the day of your Bar Mitzvah, you become obligated in all the mitzvahs. If indeed this is an active, positive commandment, then they should have been doing it right away. Every Bar Mitzvah boy, especially the children of great tzaddikim, we should have heard of them writing about them writing a Sefer Torah. Perhaps, says the Rebbe, one would suggest the answer according to the Rosh. The Rosh is one of the great halachic authorities, one of the greatest halachic authorities, and he writes that, quote, nowadays, the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah really applies to writing books, not an actual little Sefer Torah, but writing books of Chamishi Chumshei Torah, of Tanakh, of Mishnah, of Halacha, in order to fulfill this mitzvah of learning it, right? In other words, that's the books that we learn from. And in fact, the Shach takes it a step further, and he says that nowadays the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah is bedavka, is specifically in writing, or in nowadays purchasing, books from which one studies. So perhaps this could be the answer, that maybe this is why you don't find that Bar Mitzvah boys or Gdolei Yisrael should have been known about writing Sefer Torahs. Says the Rebbe, this is not a sufficient answer. Why? Because the fact is that we also don't find throughout history that a Bar Mitzvah boy should go out immediately and purchase or quote unquote write all these Sfarim, Mishnah, Gemara, and Halacha, till even down to a basic Shulchan Aruch. We don't find that to be the case. Also, according to many poskim, according to many halachic authorities, when the Rosh says, quote, nowadays the mitzvah is to write books, he's not coming to cancel out the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. He's just saying that in addition to writing an actual Sefer Torah, for practical intents and purposes, nowadays we also need to buy Svarim. In other words, you don't fully fulfill the mitzvah intended by the verse, by the Torah, if one just writes a Sefer Torah. Now, it's obviously, and besides, says the Rebbe, everybody can agree on the following point, that regardless of how you read the Rosh, the fact is that everybody would agree that it's certainly best to write a Sefer Torah. So the question goes right back. Why don't we find that Gdolei Yisrael should write a Sefer Torah? And certainly not in their Bar Mitzvah. And even though there were some who did write, but there were very few, and many of them were much later, as they progressed later, advanced in years. Therefore, we must arrive at a conclusion, says the Rebbe, that certainly they fulfilled this mitzvah, because it would be very difficult to say that throughout the generations, such great Torah giants didn't fulfill a mitzvah, one of the Taryag mitzvahs, but we must say that they fulfilled the mitzvah, but in a manner that lechatchila is the way to fulfill the mitzvah, but without actually writing a full Sefer Torah, complete Sefer Torah. And those who did write a Sefer Torah was to add in the beautification, in the hidur of the mitzvah. How do we explain it, says the Rebbe? Very simple. The custom is, in all Jewish communities, that the community owns at least one Sefer Torah. The community owns several Sefer Torahs. And this belongs to everyone. Therefore, each and every person in the community has a partial ownership, has an ownership in the Sefer Torah. Now, this, says the Rebbe, one can argue, would only work according to the opinion that says that one can fulfill the obligation of writing a Sefer Torah by means of partnership. However, according to the opinion says that no, it has to be yours, exclusively yours, the individual has to own a Torah. You have to have exclusive ownership. How do we explain it? So the Rebbe says we can explain it in accordance with the din of an esrog. As we know, the Torah says by an esrog and lulav that it has to be lochem, it has to be yours. And therefore, you're not allowed to own, you cannot fulfill the mitzvah with an esrog that's owned in a partnership. However, the halacha says, it's brought down that if it's a situation, a circumstance in which there is a shortage in esrogim, or for whatever reason it's difficult to obtain an esrog for each individual, then you do buy it in partnership and rely on the fact that when you make the bracha on the esrog, the entire community, everybody who's in a partnership, is makna to you. It means they allow you to take full ownership. They're giving it away to you for that moment. As we said, that works because while you're making the bracha on the esrog, this esrog is fully yours. And perhaps we can apply it here. That since there's a Sefer Torah that belongs to the community, so leiv bezdin masnalim. So to speak, bezdin, the heart of Bezdin means they pay attention to, and it's as if Bezdin stipulated specifically that the Sefer Torah should be his. That means that when the person goes up to make a bracha Sefer Torah, or for the purposes of him having fulfilled the mitzvah, that Sefer Torah is fully his, and it's as if he commissioned the writing of the Sefer Torah. So while the Sefer Torah is being written, it's being written not collectively for everyone, but for each and every individual. And as we said, Bezdin doesn't have to explicitly express this. Rather, the caveat is as if it's there. It's as if the heart of Bezdin already has done so. Moreover, says the Rebbe, this not only applies to people who are alive while the Sefer Torah is being written or bought, or fixed, corrected, as we said in the introduction, but this even applies to those who were born after the fact. But since they belong to the community, that is part of the stipulation, that is part of the caveat, that everybody and anybody who belongs to the community and therefore has a collective ownership of the Sefer Torah, it's as if it belongs to them individually. But how could it be? How are they going to get to quote-unquote write it? Well, periodically, every Torah needs to be checked over and needs to be upgraded, needs to be fixed, needs to be corrected. When it gets corrected, that has the same power. It is considered as if it was just written, as we explained in the introduction. Well, that is the stipulation, the condition of Bezdin, that when it gets checked and corrected, the Torah, it will be done for those who have not yet had the opportunity to, quote, write that Torah, and now they become considered as if they had done so. And according to this, even communities that didn't actually write a Torah, rather they just bought a Torah and got it corrected, the same will apply. And the individual who goes up for an aliyah, to get an aliyah in the shul, in the communal Torah, it's not like he's making a bracha on the communal Torah. In that moment, he's making a bracha because of this stipulation on his very own Torah that belongs to him exclusively. And now we can understand, now that we explained how all the Yidden throughout the generations fulfilled this mitzvah, up to the G'dolei Yisrael, which certainly they did the mitzvah in the greatest manner possible, in a manner of lechatchila. So it's obvious that this is not just a kind of a wiggly way out, but rather this is the correct way to perform the mitzvah. Now we can appreciate, going back to the original question, how did they accomplish this feat of writing each and every Jew writing a Sefer Torah on that very day of the passing of Moshe? The answer is that since it was impossible for them to all write a Sefer Torah, so when Moshe wrote a Torah for each tribe, for each congregation, for each tzibur, for each kohol, that is considered that each and every single individual, like we just explained, has a part of it. So it comes out from this that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote a Torah for each and every individual, not for collective groups, but for each and every individual. And now we can also appreciate another thing. You see, why, the question could be asked, why did Hashem have to give them this mitzvah on the very last moment? And therefore there was no other choice other than them fulfilling it in this manner. Why couldn't Hashem have told them 39 years in advance? And they could have started doing it then, and then by then everyone could have accomplished this mitzvah in the literal sense, writing an entire Sefer Torah. The answer is because the Torah applies to all times. And Hashem, if he would have given the mitzvah that way, then perhaps one would have thought, oh, that's the ideal way to do the mitzvah. The way we explained it, that you can do it by means of collective ownership, and it's considered like each individual owns it, that's only kind of like plan B. That's not really the ideal. Therefore, Hashem made it so that when he gave the mitzvah lechatchila, he gave it in such a manner that there was no other way to do the mitzvah. They had to rely on the collective writing of Moshe Rabbeinu for each individual to be considered as if he observed the mitzvah, in order to tell us that this is not just a plan B solution, but this is the right way in all future generations. When you're part of a Sefer Torah, even by virtue of just being part of the community that owns a Sefer Torah, you are in full and absolute fulfillment of this mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. Says the Rebbe, from all of this, we can understand the great importance of the idea, the mitzvah, the campaign of one acquiring, purchasing, signing up for a letter in the Sefer Torah, that then not only are you yotzei the mitzvah as being part of a Sefer Torah in a passive manner, but you're doing it actually in an active manner. You are purchasing it. You're taking your own money and it's like you're commissioning the writing of the Sefer Torah, albeit the writing of that letter, which makes it considered like you wrote the whole Torah. Says the Rebbe, in the Sichos, in the merit of this special mitzvah, each and every Jew being part of the writing of a Sefer Torah, certainly we will get to merit to go into the land with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu B'Karav Mamish.